We're learning more about one of the largest mass executions in Saudi Arabia's history. Some of the men executed on Tuesday had claimed their confessions were forced. CNN has obtained hundreds of pages of documents about their trials. Take a look.
On Tuesday, Saudi Arabia announced that it executed 37 people convicted of terror-related crimes. It was one of the largest mass executions in the kingdom's history.
The UN human rights chief is condemning mass executions carried out across Saudi Arabia, citing grave concerns that the 37 men put to death did not receive fair trials.
The court documents themselves show that a number of those accused, while in court, told the judge that their confessions were extracted under torture. The vast majority of these men were members of Saudi Arabia's Shia minority. The families weren't notified ahead of time, at least not according to Amnesty International, so they weren't even able to say goodbye to their loved ones.
We heard some of the highlights of your reporting there, but just take us through what they were charged with and why you think those confessions were forced.
Well, first of all, Max, there's actually a number of different cases whose court documents CNN's Tamara Kablawi exclusively managed to obtain, and her and our producer Ghazi Balkis have been pouring through all of these pages. And these court documents go to a couple of different cases. One is this Iran spy case, and the other one is the Awamiya 24. The Awamiya 24, that is reference to the demonstrations, anti-government demonstrations that were happening in the city of Awamiya, predominantly Shia, people there calling for freedom, for democracy, for better basic services and the like. When you look at the, especially Awamiya case, if we take that as an example, the prosecutors and these documents seem to be trying to paint this picture of the accused of being violent, of talking out, demonstrating against the government. Some of them are also accused of homosexual activity. But what is especially revealing in these documents is that a number of them say that their confessions were obtained under torture. And you have one of the men, for example, and if I just read from that, who's 27 years old, and he is partially blind, partially deaf. He says that he signed this document because he didn't know what was going on. He says, those aren't my words. He said this actually in court. He says, I didn't write this letter. This is defamation written by the interrogator in his own hand. And that's just one example of the many that our team uncovered going through all of these documents. Another big issue in all of this is that in 2017, the United Nations was actually investigating, looking into Saudi Arabia's human rights violations, and they had asked the Saudi government specifically about this case. And the Saudi government made it seem like it was a done deal, that these individuals had confessed and that the convictions stood up in trial. Well, what these court documents actually show is that in court, they said that their confession was extracted under duress, and we don't have reaction. We don't have a response from the Saudi government as to whether or not those claims to torture were ever actually investigated.
This is what we've received from an official statement on the execution. Saudi Arabia has long ago adopted a zero-tolerance policy towards terrorists. The convicted criminals who were executed today had their day in court and they were found guilty. They, like many countries, argue they have, an authoritative, independent judicial system, so we should be able to rely on it.
As somebody who promulgates human rights, the British government, Theresa May, all the senior people in government and politics need to have a really long, hard look at themselves. Are they happy to call this barbaric regime an ally?
But we as an electorate, absolutely right. But world's electorate in the so-called West, we don't care anymore about what's outside of our doors. We're electing politicians who want to roll up the drawbridge, build walls, keep it all personal. Somebody said on Facebook, it's none of our business. That's the default position that's now considered policy in countries, even in this country, even in the United States. What we've got loose in the world. How old is MBS? He's 35? We've got a Nero loose in the world, all right? He's out there. And if we don't understand that this affects all of us and don't accept it, then he's going to carry on. He's a young guy. He'll be around here for the next 60 years.
That's part of the pressure that we're seeing here is there are internal forces in Saudi Arabia that have long been there, whether that's between the princes that are competing power centers in the succession race whenever a king is near death. We also have the traditional split between Sunni and Shia, with the Saudis being the custodians of the holy mosque on the Sunni side, and have always had a restive Shia minority. And we now have a more bellicose Iran that Saudi Arabia sees as their main threat. And then we have the United States that agrees that Iran is the main threat and sees Saudi Arabia as a useful ally there, despite what's happening in places like Yemen, despite what's happening domestically in Saudi Arabia.
And then there's the issue, of course, of the legislation, the law that sort of surrounds the legal basis for which these arrests were carried out. And this terrorism, anti-terrorism law is something that the United Nations has raised its concerns about, given just how loose and vague the language actually is. I mean, very basic activities can clearly in Saudi Arabia be tried under this law. One of the young men who was executed, who was just 17 years old at the time that this so-called crime was committed, was accused of throwing Molotov cocktails at the security forces, but then also of using his BlackBerry to rally people to the protest site. Now, his father, who was representing him in court, says, according to these court documents, my son is innocent. My son did not go to these demonstrations all that often. He just went to a couple of them, not more for 5 minutes at a time. He was a student, and he was actually arrested as he was getting ready to depart for the U.S. He was arrested at the airport, and in America, he was planning on enrolling in university. And his father also says that his son's confession was obtained under duress. He says the interrogator dictated the confession to his son and then forced him to sign it so that the torture would stop.